Working as a cleaner in a luxury hotel, the woman was paralyzed when she realized the millionaire guest was her husband who died 9 years ago. She approached and... Harper Caldwell's days had become a series of routines, each one blending into the next without much variation. It was the kind of life that left little room for surprises, which suited her just fine. 9 years had passed since the plane crash that took Nathaniel from her, leaving her to raise their daughter on her own. Since then, she had found a sort of peace in predictability, even if it was a fragile one. Every morning she woke up, made breakfast for herself and her daughter, and then headed to the Riverside Hotel, where she worked as a housekeeper. The Riverside was one of the most prestigious hotels in Charleston, a place where the rich and powerful came to indulge in luxury. For Harper, it was just a job. She spent her days tidying rooms, fluffing pillows, and making sure everything sparkled just right. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and kept her daughter, Lila, in school. That was all that mattered. One evening, Harper was assigned to clean a suite on the top floor. She had been there before. It was a room reserved for VIPs, the kind of people who tipped generously but barely acknowledged her presence. As she stepped off the elevator, she noticed a group of staff whispering by the door, their expressions a mix of curiosity and excitement. Harper paid them little mind as she pushed her cart down the hallway, mentally running through her checklist. She was about to enter the room when she heard a familiar voice, a voice she hadn't heard in nearly a decade, but one she could never forget. Her heart skipped a beat, and she froze, her hand hovering over the door handle. It couldn't be. She must have misheard. But then she heard it again, clear as day, coming from inside the suite. Nathaniel. Harper's heart pounded in her chest as she slowly pushed the door open, peeking inside. The suite was spacious, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a stunning view of the Charleston harbor, but she barely noticed any of it, her gaze fixed on the man standing by the window, his back turned to her. He was speaking on the phone, his voice calm and composed, just like she remembered. Harper felt like the ground had shifted beneath her feet, and she had to grab the doorframe to steady herself. It was Nathaniel. There was no mistaking it, the way he stood, the way he spoke. But how? She had mourned him, buried him in her heart, and learned to live without him. Seeing him there, alive and well, was like a cruel joke. She wanted to rush in and confront him, to demand answers, but she couldn't move. She just stood there, watching him, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. "Nathaniel," she whispered, barely audible, but he didn't hear her. He ended his call, slipped his phone into his pocket, and turned around, his eyes scanning the room. For a moment, Harper thought he would see her, that their eyes would meet, and everything would come crashing down. But he didn't. He picked up a newspaper from the coffee table, oblivious to her presence. Harper stepped back, pulling the door closed as quietly as she could. She leaned against the wall, her mind racing. It wasn't possible. She had seen the wreckage, attended the memorial. Nathaniel had been declared dead, and there had been no doubt about it. So how was he here, in a hotel suite, looking very much alive? She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, but it was no use. The questions were piling up, and she had no answers. She knew she needed to get out of there, to go home and process what she had just seen, but her feet refused to move. Part of her wanted to barge in, to grab him and demand to know where he had been all these years. But another part of her was terrified that if she confronted him, the reality would shatter whatever fragile hope she had left. Harper eventually forced herself to walk back down the hallway, her mind still reeling. She needed to be smart about this. If Nathaniel was alive, there had to be a reason why he hadn't come back to her and Lila. She needed to find out what was going on, and she couldn't do that by panicking. When she got back to the staff room, she couldn't concentrate. The familiar routine of clocking out and collecting her things felt surreal, as if she were watching herself from a distance. She barely remembered driving home, but soon enough she was sitting in her small kitchen, a cup of tea cooling in her hands. Her daughter, Lila, was at a friend's house for a sleepover, so at least she had the night to herself. Harper sat there, replaying the moment over and over in her head. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Nathaniel's face, heard his voice, but none of it made any sense. If he was alive, why hadn't he come back? What had happened to him? And why was he here in Charleston at the riverside as if he had no past? She knew she couldn't keep this to herself, but she also knew she couldn't just walk up to Nathaniel and start asking questions. Not yet. She needed to be sure to gather more information. So she made a decision. She would find out everything she could about Nathaniel's life now, even if it meant pretending to be just another hotel employee, invisible and unnoticed. She had to know the truth, even if it broke her all over again. As she finished her tea, Harper's hand steadied and her resolve hardened. Tomorrow, she would go back to work, and she would start finding the answers she needed. For the first time in years, she felt something other than grief. It was fear, yes, but also hope. A tiny, flickering hope that maybe, just maybe, she hadn't lost everything after all. The following morning, Harper arrived at the Riverside Hotel with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. Her hands shook as she adjusted her uniform, but she took a deep breath and forced herself to focus. Today, she needed to stay calm, no matter what happened. If Nathaniel was really here, she had to find a way to get close to him without raising suspicion. As she moved through the lobby, she caught snippets of conversation between guests and staff. The buzz was palpable. A mysterious VIP had checked in the previous evening, and everyone was trying to piece together who he was. Harper listened closely, but there was no mention of his name. It was as if he'd arrived out of nowhere, cloaked in secrecy. She wondered how long he would be staying, and, more importantly, how much time she had to find out the truth. She picked up her cleaning cart and made her way to the top floor. Her shift hadn't officially assigned her to Nathaniel's suite that day, but she hoped she could find an excuse to be nearby. If she was lucky, she might catch another glimpse of him, or maybe even overhear a conversation. Anything that could explain why he was here, alive, and seemingly unaware of his past. Harper's heart skipped a beat when she reached the top floor. The door to Nathaniel's suite was closed, but she could hear faint voices coming from inside. She recognized his voice immediately, and she couldn't help but edge closer, straining to catch the words. There was another voice too, a woman's, but Harper couldn't make out what they were saying. She considered knocking, pretending she needed to clean, but something held her back. Instead, she busied herself with cleaning the hallway, hoping to blend in with the background. As she worked, the door to the suite opened, and the woman stepped out. She was tall, elegant, and impeccably dressed, definitely not hotel staff. Harper quickly lowered her gaze, pretending to focus on a spot on the floor, but she couldn't help stealing a glance. The woman glanced around, her expression serious, before walking briskly down the hallway. Harper's mind raced. Who was she? And what was she doing in Nathaniel's room? A few moments later, the door opened again, and Nathaniel stepped out. Harper's breath caught in her throat. He looked exactly as she remembered. Tall, with that same confident, easy grace that had always drawn people to him. But there was something different about him too, something she couldn't quite place. He seemed detached, almost mechanical in the way he moved. Nathaniel walked past her without so much as a glance, and Harper felt a pang of hurt. She hadn't expected a reunion, but seeing him so close and yet so distant stung in a way she hadn't anticipated. As he disappeared around the corner, she wondered what had happened to him. Was this truly the same man she had loved? She finished her tasks on the top floor and moved to the next suite, but her mind was elsewhere. All she could think about was Nathaniel, and how she could get closer to him without revealing her true identity. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to run after him, to grab his arm and make him look at her, make him remember, but she knew she couldn't afford to be reckless. If there was more to this story, she had to play it smart. That evening, Harper sat in the staff break room, clutching a cup of coffee she had no intention of drinking. The room was filled with chatter, but she was only half listening until she heard someone mention the VIP guest. Her ears perked up, and she leaned closer, pretending to adjust her uniform. "I heard he's some kind of big shot from New York," said one of the housekeepers, lowering her voice. "But nobody really knows why he's here. It's all very hush-hush." "Yeah, I heard that too," another replied. "But get this, he's booked the suite for the next 2 weeks. Must be some kind of business trip or something." Harper's mind raced. 2 weeks. That wasn't much time. But it was enough. She had 2 weeks to find out who this new Nathaniel was, and why he hadn't come back to her. The next few days followed a similar pattern. Harper continued to work her usual shifts, all the while keeping an ear out for any information about Nathaniel. She memorized his routine: when he left his room, when he returned, who visited him. She learned that he rarely left the hotel, preferring to take meetings in his suite or dine in private. And every time she caught a glimpse of him, her heart ached a little more. One afternoon, Harper managed to slip into his suite while he was out. She had 1,000 excuses ready in case anyone caught her. She could say she was checking the minibar or replacing the towels. But the suite was empty, and she took a moment to look around. It felt strange, being in his space again. But she needed answers. She carefully inspected the room, searching for anything that might give her a clue about his new life. On the desk, she found a stack of documents, mostly business contracts, but one item stood out: a notebook, half hidden under a pile of papers. Harper hesitated for a moment, then picked it up, flipping through the pages. It was filled with notes, meeting agendas, and phone numbers, but what caught her eye was a small, folded piece of paper tucked inside the back cover. She unfolded it, her hands trembling. It was a photograph, worn and faded, as if it had been carried around for years. Harper's breath hitched as she recognized the image. It was a photo of her and Nathaniel, taken on their wedding day. They were standing on a beach, arms wrapped around each other, laughing. She had no idea how this photo ended up here, but it was proof that somewhere, deep down, the man she had loved still existed. Tears stung her eyes as she carefully folded the photograph and placed it back in the notebook. She wanted to take it, to keep it close as a reminder of everything they had once shared, but she knew that wasn't an option. Instead, she placed the notebook exactly where she had found it, trying to erase any trace of her presence. As she left the suite, Harper felt a surge of determination. Nathaniel might not remember her, but she was certain now. There was a part of him that hadn't forgotten, even if he didn't realize it. She just had to find a way to reach him, to break through whatever wall had been built around his memories. Whatever it took, she was going to get him back. Over the next few days, Harper's life fell into a delicate balancing act. She carried out her regular duties at the hotel, but her mind was constantly preoccupied with thoughts of Nathaniel. She replayed every interaction, every glimpse of him, trying to pick apart any details that might explain how he could be alive and why he hadn't come back to her. It was exhausting, but she had to keep up the facade of normalcy. No one could know what she was up to. One morning, Harper arrived early for her shift, hoping to find out more about Nathaniel's schedule for the day. She knew he had a meeting in his suite later, and she planned to be nearby. As she was organizing her cleaning supplies, she overheard two of the concierge staff chatting near the front desk. "Did you hear about Mr. Brooks?" one of them whispered. Harper's ears perked up at the mention of his name. "Apparently, he's hosting a private dinner tonight with some high-profile guests." "Yeah, I heard it's some kind of business deal. They've been really secretive about it," the other responded. "I mean, he's only been here a few days, and it's like he's running the whole place." Harper's heart quickened. A private dinner meant he would be occupied for a while, which might give her a chance to dig a little deeper. She needed to know more about who Nathaniel had become and what kind of life he was living now. The day dragged on as Harper went through her routine, cleaning rooms and checking her watch, counting down the hours until Nathaniel's meeting. She was determined to be in the right place at the right time. If she could gather more information, maybe she could start to piece together the mystery of his disappearance. When the time finally came, Harper positioned herself near the top floor, pretending to be busy cleaning the hallway outside Nathaniel's suite. As she worked, she kept an eye on the door, waiting for him to leave. She was startled when she heard the sound of voices approaching from inside. She quickly ducked behind a corner as the door opened, and Nathaniel stepped out, followed by a man she didn't recognize. The man was speaking quietly, but Harper caught snippets of the conversation as they walked past her hiding spot. "Can't afford any mistakes. We need this deal to go smoothly," the man was saying, his tone stern. "The last thing we want is for anyone to start asking questions." Nathaniel nodded, his expression unreadable. "I understand. Everything is under control," he replied, his voice calm and measured. It was the same voice she remembered, but there was a coolness to it that sent a chill down Harper's spine. As the men walked away, Harper's mind raced. What kind of deal were they talking about? And why the secrecy? She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more going on, something that Nathaniel was either unwilling or unable to share. Once they were out of sight, Harper slipped into Nathaniel's suite. She knew she was taking a risk, but she needed answers. She quickly scanned the room, her eyes darting over the neatly arranged papers on the desk and the open briefcase on the floor. Her attention was drawn to a small black book lying beside a laptop. She hesitated for a moment, then reached out and picked it up, flipping through the pages. The book was filled with notes, dates, and contact names, most of which meant nothing to her. But as she skimmed through, she noticed a few names that stood out, names she recognized from her own past. Names of people who had been close to Nathaniel before the accident, people who had helped with the memorial service. Her pulse quickened as she realized that some of these people were now listed as business contacts. Why would Nathaniel be working with them now, after everything that had happened? She kept flipping, stopping when she found a note scribbled in the margins of one page. "Keep Harper out of this. She doesn't need to know." Harper's stomach lurched. Someone had written her name, and it was clear that they were trying to keep her in the dark. But who? Nathaniel? Or someone else? Before she could process what she had just read, she heard footsteps approaching the door. Harper quickly placed the book back where she found it, smoothing out the cover to make sure everything looked undisturbed. She glanced around, searching for a place to hide, but there was nowhere to go. The only thing she could do was act natural. As the door opened, Harper picked up a cleaning rag and began wiping down the nearest surface, pretending she had been there the whole time. Nathaniel walked in, stopping short when he saw her. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Harper felt a flicker of recognition in his gaze, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "Can I help you?" Nathaniel asked, his tone polite but distant. Harper's heart pounded as she struggled to keep her composure. "I'm sorry, sir. I was just cleaning up," she said, forcing a smile. "I didn't realize anyone would be back so soon." Nathaniel studied her for a moment, then nodded. "That's fine. Just make sure everything is spotless," he said, turning away to check his phone. Harper took the opportunity to slip out of the room, her hands shaking as she closed the door behind her. She managed to make it back to the service elevator without anyone noticing, but her mind was in turmoil. There was no doubt now. Someone had deliberately kept her from finding out the truth, and they were still trying to keep her in the dark. But why? Back in the break room, Harper tried to make sense of everything she had learned. She thought about the note, the business contacts, and the cryptic conversation she had overheard. It all pointed to one thing. Nathaniel was involved in something much bigger than she had realized, and he was either complicit or a pawn in someone else's game. The thought of Nathaniel being manipulated made her heart ache. She wanted to believe that he would never willingly stay away from her and Lila, but the man she had seen today was different. He was colder, more controlled, like someone who had been forced to forget who he was. Harper knew she couldn't stop now. If there was any chance of getting through to Nathaniel, she had to keep digging. She needed to find out who was behind all of this and why they had made Nathaniel disappear. But more than anything, she needed to find a way to make him remember before it was too late. Harper woke up the next morning with a new sense of urgency. The previous day's discoveries had confirmed her suspicions that something was terribly wrong, but she was still far from understanding the full extent of it. She had seen Nathaniel, spoken to him, and even caught a flicker of recognition in his eyes. But that wasn't enough. She needed answers, real answers, and she was determined to get them. At the riverside, everything was as it always was. Guests drifted in and out, staff moved quietly through the halls, and the atmosphere was one of serene luxury. But for Harper, it felt like there was a storm brewing beneath the surface. Every time she passed by Nathaniel's suite, she felt a mix of fear and hope. Fear that she was getting herself in too deep, and hope that maybe, just maybe, she could bring back the man she loved. That afternoon, Harper's opportunity came. She had overheard from the front desk that Nathaniel was scheduled to have a meeting in one of the conference rooms downstairs, which meant his suite would be empty. She knew it was risky, but she had to see what else she could find. She waited until she was sure the coast was clear, then slipped into his room, her heart pounding. The suite was pristine, just as she had left it the day before. Harper scanned the room, looking for anything that could give her more insight into Nathaniel's life now. Her eyes landed on a laptop that was still open on the desk, the screen displaying a list of recent emails. She hesitated for a moment, then moved closer, quickly glancing over the messages. Most of them were business-related, filled with discussions about investments, deals, and contracts, but one email stood out. The subject line read, "Update on Project Brooks," and Harper's stomach twisted as she clicked it open. The email was short and cryptic, but it mentioned something about keeping control over assets and avoiding unnecessary complications. It was signed with a name she didn't recognize, Anderson. Harper's mind raced. What did Project Brooks mean? Was Nathaniel part of some kind of business scheme? She tried to make sense of the words, but the more she read, the more confused she became. Nothing about this made sense, and she was starting to feel like she was in over her head. As she scrolled through the email, she noticed an attachment, a set of scanned documents. Harper's hand trembled as she opened the file, revealing a series of legal papers. Her eyes widened as she scanned the text. They were documents that appeared to transfer control of Nathaniel's assets to a trust managed by his family, dated just a few weeks after his supposed death. The terms were cold and clinical, stripping him of any control over his fortune and assigning it to other members of the Brooks family. It was clear now. Nathaniel's disappearance hadn't been an accident. It had been orchestrated. Someone had wanted him out of the picture, and they had gone to great lengths to make it happen. But who and why? Harper's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a door opening. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Nathaniel was standing there, his expression blank, his eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Harper felt like a deer caught in headlights, unsure whether to run or stand her ground. "What are you doing here?" Nathaniel asked, his tone devoid of warmth. Harper swallowed hard, scrambling for an excuse. "I'm sorry, sir. I was just checking to see if there was anything that needed to be cleaned," she stammered, trying to sound casual. Nathaniel's gaze didn't waver. "You've been spending a lot of time around my suite lately," he said, his voice measured. "Is there something you're not telling me?" Harper's mind raced. She had to tread carefully. One wrong move, and everything could come crashing down. "No, sir, I'm just doing my job," she replied, forcing a smile. "But if there's anything specific you need, I'd be happy to help." Nathaniel's expression softened slightly, and for a fleeting moment, Harper thought she saw a hint of the man she used to know. But then it was gone, replaced by the same cold, distant mask. "There's nothing I need. You can go," he said, turning away from her. Harper took a step back, her hands trembling as she made her way to the door. She had been so close to understanding what was happening, and now it felt like she was slipping further away. But as she left the suite, she caught sight of something she hadn't noticed before. There was a photograph on the bedside table, partially hidden behind a lamp. It was a picture of a young woman, smiling, her hair blowing in the wind. Harper froze, staring at the photograph. She knew that face. It was the same woman she had seen leaving Nathaniel's room a few days ago. Who was she, and what was her connection to all of this? Harper's mind buzzed with questions, but she knew she couldn't linger. She needed to leave before Nathaniel started asking more questions. That evening, Harper sat in her small apartment, replaying the events of the day over and over in her head. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something, some crucial piece of the puzzle. The emails, the legal documents, the photograph. They were all connected, but she couldn't see how. She felt like she was trying to put together a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing. As she lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, Harper made a decision. She couldn't keep tiptoeing around the edges, hoping to stumble across answers. If she wanted to find out the truth, she was going to have to be bold. She was going to have to confront Nathaniel directly, even if it meant risking everything. The next day, Harper returned to the hotel with a plan. She knew it was dangerous, but she had to speak to Nathaniel. She needed to understand why he was here, why he hadn't come back to her, and what this Project Brooks was all about. But more than anything, she needed to know if there was still a part of him that remembered her, that remembered the life they had shared. As she stepped off the elevator onto the top floor, Harper's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know what she would say or how he would react, but she was done hiding. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and knocked on the door to Nathaniel's suite. There was a pause, then the sound of footsteps approaching. The door opened, and Nathaniel stood there, his expression unreadable. For a moment, they just stared at each other, the silence stretching between them. Then Harper spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. "We need to talk." Nathaniel's eyes narrowed as he regarded Harper standing at his door. For a brief moment, Harper thought he might refuse her, might just close the door and shut her out completely. But after a few tense seconds, he stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. Harper took a shaky breath and walked past him into the suite, the air thick with tension. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times in her head, picturing how she would confront him, the things she would say. But now, standing in the same room as Nathaniel, with him looking at her like she was a stranger, every word she had prepared seemed to vanish. She turned to face him, searching his eyes for any hint of recognition, but all she found was that same distant, guarded expression. "I don't understand," Harper began, her voice trembling slightly. "How are you here? You were supposed to be dead." Nathaniel's jaw tightened, and he looked away, as if the question pained him. "I'm sorry, but I think there's been some mistake," he said flatly. "I don't know what you're talking about." Harper's heart sank, but she wasn't about to back down. "Nathaniel, please. It's me, Harper," she said, taking a step closer. "We were married. We had a life together, a daughter. How can you not remember any of it?" For a moment, there was a flicker in Nathaniel's eyes, something almost like recognition, but it was quickly replaced by confusion. I don't know who you are," he said, shaking his head. "I'm sorry, but I have no memory of what you're talking about." Harper felt like she had been punched in the stomach. She had been prepared for anger, for denial, but this blank, uncomprehending look was worse than anything she could have imagined. "They did something to you, didn't they?" she whispered. "Your family. They made you forget." Nathaniel's gaze snapped back to her, sharp and alert. "You should leave," he said, his voice colder now. "This conversation is over." "No, it's not," Harper snapped, her frustration boiling over. "I've spent 9 years thinking you were dead, mourning you, and now I find out you're alive, and you're telling me you don't even remember me. That's not fair, Nathaniel." You owe me an explanation." Nathaniel's eyes darkened, and he took a step back, his expression hardening. "I don't owe you anything," he said, his tone icy. "I don't know who you are, and I don't know what you think you're going to accomplish by coming here, but this needs to stop." Harper felt tears sting her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wasn't going to let him push her away, not when she was so close to finding the truth. "You used to love me," she said softly. "I know you did. And I know there's still a part of you that remembers, even if you don't want to admit it." Nathaniel hesitated, and Harper could see the internal struggle playing out behind his eyes. He opened his mouth to say something, but before he could speak, there was a knock at the door. Harper tensed, her mind racing. Who could it be? She hadn't planned for anyone else to be here. Nathaniel's expression shifted into something more guarded, and he moved to open the door. Harper's stomach twisted as she recognized the woman standing there, the same woman she had seen leaving his room a few days ago, the woman in the photograph. She was carrying a briefcase and wearing a cool, professional smile. But there was a sharpness in her eyes as she glanced at Harper. "Am I interrupting something?" the woman asked, her tone polite but firm. "No, we were just finishing up," Nathaniel said quickly, glancing back at Harper with a warning look. "What do you need, Anderson?" Anderson. Harper's blood ran cold. That was the name she had seen in the emails, the person who seemed to be orchestrating whatever Project Brooks was. She felt a sudden urge to confront this woman, to demand answers, but she forced herself to stay calm. She couldn't afford to blow her cover now, not when she was so close. Anderson's smile didn't waver as she stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "I need to go over some documents with you, but it can wait if you're busy," she said, her eyes flicking to Harper and then back to Nathaniel. "Who is she?" Harper's heart pounded as she waited for Nathaniel to answer. Would he tell Anderson the truth? Would he even know what the truth was? But to her surprise, he simply said, "She's no one, just a member of the staff who got a little too curious." The words stung, but Harper swallowed her pride and forced herself to stay quiet. She needed to play along, at least until she could figure out what was going on. Anderson seemed satisfied with Nathaniel's explanation, and she turned her attention back to him. "If that's the case, I'd appreciate it if you could leave us to our business," Anderson said, giving Harper a pointed look. "This is a private matter." Harper's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She wanted to scream, to demand that Nathaniel tell her the truth, but she knew that wouldn't get her anywhere. Not now. So she took a deep breath and nodded, forcing herself to stay calm. "Of course," she said quietly. "I'll just leave you to it." As she walked to the door, she glanced back at Nathaniel one last time, hoping to see some sign that he understood what she was trying to do. But his expression was blank, as if he had already forgotten she was there. Harper's heart ached as she stepped out into the hallway, the door closing softly behind her. She stood there for a moment, trying to process everything that had just happened. Anderson was clearly involved in whatever had happened to Nathaniel, and she wasn't just a business associate. She had to be part of the reason he was acting like this, why he couldn't remember his past. Harper's mind whirled with questions, but one thing was clear. She was going to have to dig deeper if she wanted to get to the truth. As she made her way back down the hallway, Harper's thoughts drifted back to the life she and Nathaniel had shared, the way he used to smile at her, the way he would hold her close when they danced in the living room. She couldn't let that all be erased. Whatever had been done to him, she was going to find a way to undo it, even if it meant confronting Anderson and whoever else was behind this. Harper didn't know how she was going to do it yet, but she had made a promise to herself the day she saw Nathaniel alive again. She wasn't going to lose him twice. And if Anderson thought she could just brush Harper off, she was about to find out just how wrong she was. Over the next few days, Harper kept a low profile at the Riverside Hotel, blending into the background as she went about her duties. But her mind was far from quiet. The confrontation with Nathaniel and the unsettling presence of Anderson had left her more determined than ever to uncover the truth. She had no doubt now that Anderson was deeply involved in whatever had happened to Nathaniel, and if Harper wanted answers, she would need to learn more about her. Harper's opportunity came sooner than she expected. One afternoon, she was tidying up in one of the back corridors when she heard Anderson's voice. She ducked behind a corner and listened, heart pounding, as Anderson spoke quietly to another man, a hotel manager Harper recognized. "Ensure there are no interruptions," Anderson was saying. "Mr. Brooks has a strict schedule, and we can't afford any distractions. Understood?" "Yes, Ms. Anderson," the manager replied. "I'll make sure everything runs smoothly." As the two of them walked away, Harper's mind raced. She had to find out what Anderson was planning. If she could get close enough, maybe she could overhear something that would give her a clue about Nathaniel's situation. She followed at a safe distance, keeping to the shadows, until she saw Anderson slip into one of the small conference rooms on the lower floor. Harper hesitated for a moment, then decided to take a risk. She grabbed a cleaning cart from a nearby supply closet and wheeled it down the hall, using it as a cover to get closer to the conference room. When she reached the door, she pressed her ear against the wood, straining to hear what was being said inside. "The treatments are holding, but there's still a risk," Anderson was saying. "He's starting to have moments of clarity, flashes of his old life. We need to keep a close eye on him or we'll lose control." Harper's blood ran cold. Treatments? What kind of treatments? And how long had they been doing this to Nathaniel? She could hardly breathe as she listened, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Is there any way to adjust the dosage?" another voice asked. Harper didn't recognize this one, but he sounded nervous, like he was out of his depth. "There's only so much we can do without causing irreversible damage," Anderson replied, her tone clipped. "We've already taken considerable risks to get him to this point. If we push too hard, he could break, and then all of this will have been for nothing." Harper's hands trembled as she absorbed what she was hearing. They were drugging him, controlling his mind, and it was clear that whatever they were doing, it was far from safe. She had suspected that Nathaniel's memory loss wasn't natural, but hearing it confirmed like this made her feel sick. They were deliberately keeping him in the dark, manipulating him, and she still didn't understand why. The conversation continued, but Harper's mind was already racing ahead. She needed to find out more about these treatments and see if there was a way to reverse them. But how could she do that without tipping off Anderson? Harper's thoughts were interrupted when she heard footsteps approaching from the other side of the hallway. She quickly pushed the cart away from the door and pretended to be cleaning, hoping no one would notice her. A man in a suit rounded the corner and glanced at her, but didn't pay her much attention. Harper kept her head down, her heart pounding, until he disappeared around the corner. She knew she couldn't stay here any longer. It was too risky, but she had heard enough to know what she needed to do next. She had to find out exactly what kind of treatments Nathaniel was being given, and who was behind it. That night, after her shift ended, Harper went home and sat at her kitchen table, staring at her laptop. She hadn't wanted to risk drawing attention by looking up anything about Nathaniel's condition at the hotel, so she decided to do some research on her own time. She typed in a few keywords, searching for anything that might explain the kind of memory suppression techniques Anderson had been talking about. It didn't take long for her to find articles about experimental treatments, things that sounded like science fiction but were apparently being developed in secret by various companies. There were mentions of drugs that could suppress certain memories, erase traumatic events, even create new ones. Harper felt a chill run down her spine as she read. Could this really be what they had done to Nathaniel? Had they erased her from his mind, or worse, implanted new memories to replace her? As she dug deeper, she found something that made her heart stop. An article about a company that specialized in memory modification, headquartered in New York. The company's CEO was listed as Marcus Anderson. Harper recognized the name immediately. This had to be the same Anderson she had seen at the hotel. But the article didn't just list Marcus Anderson as the CEO. It also mentioned a collaboration with several prominent law firms, including one that Harper knew had ties to Nathaniel's family. It all started to make sense now. Anderson was working with Nathaniel's family to control his assets, and they were using these experimental treatments to keep him compliant. They had manipulated his memory, making him forget his past so that they could pull the strings without interference. Harper's stomach churned at the thought. They had stolen Nathaniel's life, and they were using him like a puppet. Harper knew she had to act fast. If Anderson and her associates realized she was onto them, they would do everything in their power to shut her down. But she couldn't just sit by and do nothing. She had to find a way to get Nathaniel out of this, to make him remember who he was and the life they had built together. The next morning, Harper went back to work, her mind buzzing with plans. She had to be careful, but she was more determined than ever. She kept her distance from Anderson and Nathaniel, watching and listening for any opportunity to learn more. Every time she saw Nathaniel, she felt a pang of sadness, but she also felt hope. There had been moments, brief as they were, where he seemed to recognize her, even if he couldn't understand why. She had to believe that those memories were still there, buried beneath whatever Anderson had done to him. During her break, Harper sat outside the hotel, sipping her coffee and trying to think of her next move. She needed to find a way to get closer to Nathaniel, to talk to him without anyone else around. But how could she do that without raising suspicion? As she pondered her options, an idea began to form in her mind, an idea that was risky, but it just might work. If she could get access to the room where they kept Nathaniel's treatment records, she might be able to find out exactly what they had been doing to him. It was a long shot, but it was the best plan she had. And if she could find proof of what they were doing, she might even be able to use it to force Anderson's hand. Harper didn't know how much time she had, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to give up. Not when she was so close to bringing Nathaniel back. Whatever it took, she was going to make him remember. Harper spent the next few days carefully watching and waiting, trying to gather as much information as she could without drawing attention to herself. It was difficult. Every time she saw Nathaniel, she had to fight the urge to rush to him, to grab him by the shoulders and beg him to remember. But she knew that if she acted recklessly, she would ruin any chance she had of getting to the bottom of this. Her plan was risky, but it was the only one she could think of. She needed to find a way to access the files that Anderson and her team were using to control Nathaniel's treatment. She had seen Anderson carry a briefcase into the conference room during one of their meetings, and she was willing to bet that it held something important: documents, notes, maybe even details about the drugs they were using on Nathaniel. If she could get her hands on it, even for a few minutes, she might find the proof she needed. Harper waited for her chance, and one afternoon, it finally came. She was cleaning the hallway near the conference room when she saw Anderson step out, talking on her phone. Anderson didn't seem to notice Harper as she walked briskly down the hall, her expression focused and serious. Harper's heart pounded as she glanced into the room, seeing the briefcase sitting on the table, left unattended. This was it, her window of opportunity. Harper knew she didn't have much time, but she couldn't let it slip away. She glanced around to make sure no one was watching, then slipped into the conference room, closing the door behind her. The briefcase was right there, within arm's reach, and Harper felt a surge of adrenaline as she snapped it open. She didn't know how long she had, so she worked quickly, rifling through the papers inside. Most of it was standard business documents, contracts, meeting agendas, financial reports, but buried beneath them, she found a thick folder labeled Brooks Project, Treatment Protocol. Harper's hands shook as she opened the folder, scanning the first few pages. What she read made her blood run cold. The documents detailed a series of experimental treatments designed to suppress specific memories and alter cognitive function. There were notes about dosages, schedules, and even a list of expected side effects, which ranged from mild confusion to complete memory loss. Harper's stomach churned as she realized that Nathaniel hadn't just been drugged. He had been systematically manipulated, his mind altered to erase parts of his past. She felt sick as she read through the cold, clinical descriptions, each word cutting into her like a knife. One page stood out in particular, a progress report that mentioned persistent memory fragments that had been difficult to suppress. Harper's breath caught as she read the next line. Subject has shown signs of recalling past personal connections, specifically related to HCHC. It could only mean Harper Caldwell. They knew about her, and they had been trying to erase her from Nathaniel's mind. A wave of fury washed over Harper. They had stolen his memories, taken away everything that made him who he was, and now they were trying to erase her, too. She wanted to scream, to tear the papers to shreds, but she forced herself to stay calm. She needed to keep these documents. But if she took them, Anderson would know something was wrong. Harper quickly pulled out her phone and snapped photos of each page, making sure to capture every detail. As she finished, she heard footsteps approaching. Panic surged through her as she hastily closed the briefcase and pushed it back into place. She barely had time to hide her phone in her pocket and straighten up before the door opened, and Anderson walked back in. Harper's heart raced as she quickly pretended to be wiping down a nearby table, hoping Anderson wouldn't notice anything amiss. "What are you doing in here?" Anderson asked, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Harper. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Harper said, forcing a nervous smile. "I was just cleaning up. I didn't realize anyone would be back so soon." Anderson stared at her for a moment, as if trying to decide whether or not to believe her. Harper could feel the weight of that gaze, and she prayed that Anderson wouldn't see through her lie. Finally, Anderson's expression softened, and she nodded. "Just make sure everything is in order and then leave," she said curtly, walking over to the briefcase and snapping it shut. Harper's pulse quickened as she realized how close she had come to being caught, but she managed to keep her composure, nodding obediently as she gathered her supplies and left the room. Once she was safely out of sight, Harper ducked into a supply closet and pulled out her phone, scrolling through the photos she had taken. She had the proof now, the proof that Nathaniel had been manipulated, that Anderson and her associates had been deliberately suppressing his memories. But she also had more questions. Why had they gone to such lengths to control him? What were they trying to hide, and why was his family involved? Harper knew she needed help. This was bigger than she could handle on her own. And if she wanted to get Nathaniel back, she was going to have to confront Anderson directly. But she couldn't do it alone. She needed to find someone who could help her understand these documents, someone who could expose what was happening. She thought about going to the authorities, but she had no idea who she could trust. As she left the supply closet and made her way back to the lobby, Harper's mind was racing with possibilities. She had to find someone outside the hotel, someone who wasn't connected to Anderson or Nathaniel's family. Maybe she could find a journalist, or even a private investigator, someone who could help her figure out what to do next. But as she approached the lobby, she saw something that made her heart stop. Nathaniel was there, standing by the entrance, talking to a man she didn't recognize. He was dressed casually, his posture relaxed, but there was a tension in his expression that Harper hadn't seen before. She slowed her pace, trying to listen in on their conversation without drawing attention to herself. "I don't like this. Anderson's pushing too hard," the man was saying, his voice low but insistent. "If he starts remembering, everything could fall apart." Nathaniel's response was quieter, but Harper could just make out his words. She said, "It's under control. We just need to be patient." Harper's blood ran cold. Was Nathaniel aware of what was happening to him? Was he complicit, or was he just repeating what he had been told? She had no idea how much of what he was saying was really him, and how much was the result of the manipulation he had been subjected to. Harper knew she couldn't stay hidden any longer. She had to talk to him to find out the truth. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and stepped forward, making her way toward Nathaniel and the other man. As she got closer, she saw Nathaniel glance up, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of recognition, but it was gone just as quickly, replaced by the same distant, guarded look she had seen before. "Harper," he said, his voice flat, as if saying her name was just another part of the routine. "What are you doing here?" "I need to talk to you," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Alone." The man beside Nathaniel looked irritated, but Nathaniel raised a hand, signaling him to wait. "It's fine. he said. "Give us a minute." The man hesitated, then nodded and walked away, leaving Harper and Nathaniel standing in the lobby, surrounded by the hum of hotel activity. Harper's heart pounded as she looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of the man she used to know. "Please, Nathaniel," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I need to know what's happening to you. I need you to remember." Nathaniel's eyes softened for a brief moment as Harper stood before him, her expression pleading, but then the guarded, detached look returned. He glanced around the bustling lobby, as if calculating how much attention their conversation might draw. Harper's heart sank, but she held her ground, refusing to back down. "Let's go somewhere quieter," Nathaniel said finally, his voice low. "Follow me." He led her down a hallway to a small, unoccupied lounge area, away from the main flow of guests. Harper's pulse quickened as she followed him, trying to prepare herself for whatever this conversation would bring. When they reached the lounge, Nathaniel turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "What is it you want, Harper?" he asked, his tone calm but distant. "I don't understand why you're doing this." Harper took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I'm trying to understand what's happened to you," she said. "I know that you don't remember me, but I also know that it's not your fault. Someone has done this to you. They've been controlling you, manipulating your memories." Nathaniel's eyes flickered, and for a moment Harper thought she saw a flash of uncertainty, but it quickly disappeared. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "You're mistaken." "I'm not mistaken," Harper insisted, her voice trembling with emotion. "I've seen the documents, Nathaniel. I know about the treatments. Anderson, your family, they've been controlling you, making you forget your past. I don't know why they're doing it, but I need you to trust me. I need you to believe that what I'm telling you is the truth." Nathaniel's expression hardened, and he shook his head. "You don't understand," he said, his voice sharper now. "My family is protecting me. They're making sure I'm safe." "Safe?" Harper repeated, incredulous. "Do you really believe that? They're keeping you under their control, Nathaniel. They've erased everything that made you who you are. How can you think that's protection?" Nathaniel's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Harper thought he might lash out at her, but instead, he just looked at her with a kind of resigned sadness. "I don't know who you think I am," he said quietly, "but I'm not the person you're looking for." Harper's heart ached at the words. She could see that he was trying to push her away, but she refused to give up. "I know you don't remember everything," she said, her voice softening. "But there has to be a part of you that recognizes me, even if it's just a little. We were married, Nathaniel. We had a daughter together. Do you really not feel anything when you hear that?" Nathaniel's expression faltered, and for a split second, Harper thought she saw a glimmer of something. Recognition, maybe, or pain. But then he shook his head, and the moment was gone. "I don't remember," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry." Harper felt tears sting her eyes, but she blinked them back. She couldn't afford to break down now, not when she was so close. "You don't have to apologize," she said gently. "This isn't your fault, but you need to understand that there are people who are using you. They've been giving you drugs, treatments, to make you forget. I have proof." Nathaniel's gaze sharpened, and for the first time, she saw a hint of doubt. "What proof?" he asked. Harper pulled out her phone, her hands shaking slightly as she scrolled through the photos she had taken of the documents in Anderson's briefcase. She handed the phone to Nathaniel, watching as he studied the images, his brow furrowing. As he scrolled through the photos, she could see the confusion and anger building in his eyes. "This is a lie," he said finally, his voice unsteady. "It has to be. My family would never do this to me." "I wish it were a lie," Harper said softly, "but it's not. They've been using you, Nathaniel. They're controlling your life, and they're trying to erase everything we had together. But you can fight this. You can remember." Nathaniel's hands clenched around the phone, his knuckles white. "Anderson told me. She told me they were helping me," he said, his voice breaking. "That I had been through something traumatic, and this was the only way to make things right." "They lied to you," Harper said, stepping closer. "Whatever they told you, it wasn't the truth. Please, Nathaniel. You have to trust me. I know it's confusing, but you can't let them keep doing this to you." Nathaniel's eyes flickered with uncertainty, and Harper could see the struggle playing out in his mind. She reached out and gently touched his arm, trying to offer him some comfort. "I love you," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "And I know you loved me too. That love didn't just disappear. It's still there, somewhere inside you." Nathaniel closed his eyes, his face contorted with pain. "I don't know what to believe," he said, his voice raw. "Everything feels wrong, like I'm living someone else's life." "You are," Harper said, her heart breaking for him. "But you don't have to anymore. We can figure this out together. You just have to let me help you." Before Nathaniel could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, and Harper's stomach tightened with dread. She turned to see Anderson approaching, her expression cold and unyielding. Harper instinctively moved closer to Nathaniel, shielding him from Anderson's gaze. "What's going on here?" Anderson demanded, her eyes narrowing as she looked between Harper and Nathaniel. "I thought I made it clear that Mr. Brooks doesn't need any unnecessary distractions." Harper's heart raced, but she refused to back down. "He deserves to know the truth," she said, her voice steady. "You've been manipulating him, controlling his life. It's time for that to stop." Anderson's lips curled into a tight, humorless smile. "You have no idea what you're talking about," she said. "Mr. Brooks is under my care, and everything we've done has been for his benefit." "For his benefit?" Harper shot back, her anger boiling over. "You've been drugging him, erasing his memories, and using him to control his fortune. How is that for his benefit?" Anderson's eyes glinted with a dangerous light. "You're overstepping, Ms. Caldwell," she said quietly. "I suggest you leave before you make things worse for yourself." Nathaniel's head snapped up at that, his eyes filled with confusion and fear. "What do you mean, make things worse?" he asked, his voice trembling. "What are you going to do to her?" Anderson's expression remained calm, but there was a coldness in her eyes that sent a chill down Harper's spine. "Nothing, as long as she understands her place," she said. "But this little outburst needs to end, now." Harper took a step forward, refusing to be intimidated. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I know what you're doing, and I'm not going to let you keep hurting him." Nathaniel looked between Harper and Anderson, his face pale and drawn. For a moment, Harper thought he might break through the fog that had been clouding his mind, but then he shook his head, as if trying to clear away the confusion. I don't know what to do," he said, his voice barely audible. Harper felt a surge of desperation. She could see that Nathaniel was struggling, torn between the lies he had been told and the truth she was trying to show him. But before she could say anything more, Anderson stepped forward, her eyes cold and unyielding. "Mr. Brooks," she said firmly, "come with me. Now." Nathaniel hesitated, looking back at Harper one last time. She could see the fear and confusion in his eyes, and she wanted to reach out, to pull him away from Anderson's control. But he didn't move, and after a moment, he turned and followed Anderson down the hall, leaving Harper standing alone in the empty lounge, her heart breaking all over again. Harper stood in the empty lounge, her heart pounding as she watched Nathaniel walk away with Anderson. She had come so close, closer than ever before, and yet, in the end, she still couldn't break through the walls that had been built around his mind. But she wasn't giving up. Not now. Not when she had seen that flicker of doubt in his eyes, the brief moment when he seemed to question everything he had been told. She needed a new plan, and she needed it fast. Anderson was clearly tightening her grip on Nathaniel, and if Harper didn't act soon, she might lose any chance of reaching him. As she stood there, trying to think, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a message from an unknown number. "Meet me at the cafe across the street at 8 p.m. We need to talk. A friend." Harper's brow furrowed. She didn't recognize the number, but the message made her uneasy. Was it a trap? A warning? Or was there someone else out there who knew what was going on? She hesitated for a moment, then decided she had nothing left to lose. If someone was willing to talk to her, she needed to find out what they knew. At 8 p.m., sharp, Harper walked into the small, dimly lit cafe across from the Riverside Hotel. The place was quiet, with only a few patrons scattered around, nursing cups of coffee and reading newspapers. Harper scanned the room, looking for anyone who might be her mysterious friend, but she didn't see anyone she recognized. She was about to turn around and leave when a voice called out, "Over here." Harper turned and saw a man sitting in a corner booth, his face partially obscured by the shadows. He waved her over, and she hesitated for a moment before making her way to the booth and sliding into the seat across from him. "Who are you?" Harper asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Why did you want to meet me?" The man leaned forward, and Harper finally got a good look at his face. He was in his mid-40s, with a slight stubble and tired eyes, like someone who hadn't slept well in days. "My name is Marcus Anderson," he said quietly. "I'm the brother of the woman you've been dealing with." Harper's eyes widened in shock. "You're related to her?" she asked, barely able to contain her disbelief. "Why would you want to help me?" Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Because I'm tired of seeing my sister ruin people's lives," he said. "I know what she's been doing to Nathaniel, and I can't stand by and watch it happen anymore." Harper's heart skipped a beat. "You know about the treatments?" she asked, her voice rising. "Then why haven't you done anything to stop her?" Marcus hesitated, and for a moment, Harper thought he might walk away. But then he spoke, his voice low and pained. "It's complicated," he said. "Anderson, my sister, has a lot of connections, powerful ones. She's been able to cover her tracks and make sure no one asks too many questions. But she's pushing things too far with Nathaniel, and I'm afraid of what might happen if she keeps going." Harper leaned forward, her mind racing. Why? What's she trying to do to him? Marcus glanced around the cafe, as if making sure no one was listening. "The treatments, they're not just about memory suppression," he said. "They're about control. She's been using a combination of drugs and psychological conditioning to keep Nathaniel compliant, to make sure he doesn't question what she tells him. It's a method she's used before, but never on someone this high profile." Harper felt a chill run down her spine. "Why would she do that?" she asked, horrified. "Why go to such lengths to control him?" Marcus sighed again, and Harper could see the regret in his eyes. "It's about the money," he said simply. "Nathaniel's family has a lot of it, and they needed to make sure it stayed within their control. When Nathaniel survived that plane crash, it complicated things. He was supposed to be out of the picture, but when he turned up alive, my sister saw an opportunity. She convinced the family that she could handle him, keep him under control, and they gave her free rein to do whatever she wanted." Harper felt like she was going to be sick. "So they've just been using him?" she asked, barely able to comprehend what she was hearing. "Like a puppet?" "Yes," Marcus said, his voice heavy with guilt. "Anderson has always been good at manipulating people, but she's gone too far this time. I thought I could keep my distance. But after seeing what she's done to Nathaniel, I can't keep quiet anymore." Harper's mind reeled. She had known there was something sinister going on, but she hadn't imagined it was this bad. "Then help me stop her," she said, her voice shaking. "I need to find a way to get through to Nathaniel, to make him remember who he really is." Marcus hesitated, and Harper could see the conflict in his eyes. "It won't be easy," he said. "The conditioning is deep, and the drugs she's using are strong. But if you can get him to remember even a little bit, something personal, something that's tied to who he is, it might be enough to break through." Harper felt a surge of hope. "I can do that," she said. "I have to." Marcus nodded, but there was a sadness in his expression. "Be careful," he said. "If my sister finds out what you're doing, she won't hesitate to shut you down, and she has ways of making problems disappear." Harper's heart pounded as she absorbed his words. "I don't care," she said fiercely. "I'm not going to let her keep hurting him." Marcus gave her a long, hard look, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small vial. "Take this," he said, sliding it across the table. "It's a counteragent to some of the drugs she's been giving him. If you can get him to take it, it might help clear his head, at least for a little while. But be careful, it won't last long, and once she finds out, she'll double down on the treatments." Harper stared at the vial, her hand shaking as she picked it up. This was it, her chance to reach Nathaniel, to break through the fog that had been clouding his mind. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't know how I can ever repay you." "Just make sure she doesn't win," Marcus said, his eyes dark and tired. "That's all I ask." Harper slipped the vial into her pocket, her mind buzzing with a mix of fear and determination. She had to be smart about this, had to find the right moment to use it. But at least now she had a plan, and she wasn't alone. As she left the cafe and stepped back out into the night, Harper felt a renewed sense of purpose. She didn't know what was going to happen, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to stop until she had Nathaniel back. Whatever it took, she was going to make him remember, and she was going to make sure Anderson's plans crumbled to the ground. Harper returned to the Riverside Hotel the next morning, her heart pounding as she clutched the small vial in her pocket. She hadn't slept much the night before, her mind racing with thoughts of what Marcus had told her and what she needed to do next. She knew she was running out of time. Anderson was tightening her control over Nathaniel, and if Harper didn't act soon, she might lose him forever. She had to find the right moment, the perfect opportunity to slip Nathaniel the counteragent without arousing suspicion. But more than that, she needed to make sure he was in a place where he could feel safe, where, even if just for a few minutes, he could let his guard down. Harper knew it was a long shot, but it was the only plan she had. As she started her shift, Harper kept an eye out for Nathaniel, hoping she might catch a glimpse of him. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw him exiting the elevator, his expression distant and preoccupied. He was alone, without Anderson or any of her associates around, and Harper seized the moment. She approached him cautiously, her voice gentle but urgent. "Nathaniel," she said, causing him to stop and turn. For a moment, he just stared at her, as if trying to place her face. "I need to talk to you, please, just for a minute." Nathaniel hesitated, glancing around the lobby as if expecting Anderson to appear at any moment. Harper could see the conflict in his eyes, the war between the fragments of his past and the conditioning that had been forced upon him. She took a step closer, lowering her voice. "There's something I need you to see," she said, her tone soft but insistent. "It won't take long, I promise." Nathaniel's expression wavered, and for a moment, Harper thought he might refuse. But then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. "All right," he said quietly. "Just a minute." Harper led him to a small private lounge area on the far side of the hotel, away from the main flow of guests and staff. As they entered, she closed the door behind them, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. She needed to find a way to make him take the counteragent without raising suspicion, and she needed to do it now. She pulled out the vial, holding it out to him. "I need you to trust me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. This might help you remember." Nathaniel eyed the vial warily, his brow furrowing. "What is that?" he asked, suspicion creeping into his voice. "It's a counteragent," Harper explained, trying to keep her tone calm and reassuring. "It can help clear your mind, even if just for a little while. I know this sounds crazy, but you have to believe me. They've been using drugs to control you, to make you forget everything about your past. But if you take this, maybe you'll be able to remember." Nathaniel's hands trembled as he took the vial, staring at it as if it held the answers to every question he had ever been afraid to ask. "I don't understand," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Why would they do this to me?" Harper's heart ached at the confusion and fear in his eyes. "Because they want to control you," she said softly. "They're afraid of what you might do if you remember who you really are. But you don't have to let them win. You can fight this." Nathaniel looked up at her, and for the first time, Harper saw a flicker of determination in his eyes. "All right," he said, his voice steadier than before. "I'll do it." He uncapped the vial and quickly swallowed its contents, grimacing slightly at the taste. Harper watched him anxiously, praying that the counteragent would work, that it would be enough to break through the fog that had been clouding his mind. She could only wait and hope. For a few moments, nothing happened. Nathaniel just stood there, his expression blank, and Harper felt a wave of panic rise in her chest. What if it didn't work? What if she had been wrong, and there was no way to bring him back? But then, slowly, Nathaniel's eyes widened, and he staggered back, clutching his head as if in pain. Harper rushed to his side, her hands trembling as she reached out to steady him. "Nathaniel, are you okay?" she asked, her voice frantic. "What's happening?" I don't know," Nathaniel gasped, his breathing ragged. "It's like flashes. I can see things, but they don't make sense." Harper's heart pounded as she watched him struggle, torn between relief and fear. The counteragent was working, but it was clear that the process was painful. She held his hands, trying to offer him comfort, even as his grip tightened painfully around her fingers. "Harper," he said suddenly, his voice strained. I remember us, our wedding, the way you laughed, the way you cried when Lila was born. But then, everything goes dark." Tears filled Harper's eyes as she listened, her heart swelling with hope. "That's because they took those memories from you," she said softly. "But they're still there, Nathaniel. You just have to keep fighting." Nathaniel's expression contorted with pain as more memories flooded back, and he sank to his knees, his hands clutching at his head. "Why?" he whispered, his voice broken. "Why would they do this to me?" Before Harper could respond, the door to the lounge burst open, and Anderson stormed in, her eyes blazing with fury. "What the hell is going on here?" she demanded, her gaze locking onto the empty vial in Nathaniel's hand. "What did you give him?" Harper's blood ran cold, but she stepped in front of Nathaniel, shielding him from Anderson's rage. "I gave him a chance to remember," she said, her voice defiant. "Something you've been trying to take away from him." Anderson's lips curled into a snarl. "You stupid girl," she spat. "Do you have any idea what you've done? He can't handle this. He's going to break." "No," Harper said, shaking her head. "He's not going to break. He's going to fight, and you're not going to stop him." Anderson's eyes glinted with a dangerous light, and she took a step closer, her voice cold. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," she said. "You think you can just waltz in here and undo everything we've done? You're out of your depth, Harper." Nathaniel struggled to his feet, his face pale and drawn, but his eyes were clear. "No, Anderson," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "You're the one who's out of your depth. I remember everything now." Anderson's eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked genuinely afraid. "Nathaniel, you don't understand?" "I understand perfectly," he said, cutting her off. "You've been using me, controlling me, but I won't let you do it anymore." Anderson's face twisted with fury, and she lunged for the vial, but Nathaniel moved faster. He grabbed her arm, his grip firm but unyielding, and pulled her back. "It's over, Anderson," he said. "You can't control me anymore." Anderson's eyes blazed with hatred, but she didn't try to resist. Instead, she smiled, a cold, malicious smile that sent chills down Harper's spine. "You think this is over?" she said softly. "It's not. You may have your memories back, but you're still mine, Nathaniel, and I'm not going to let you go." Nathaniel's face hardened, and Harper could see the pain in his eyes, the struggle between the past and the present. But then, he looked at Harper, and his expression softened, a look of pure love and determination shining through. "If that's what it takes to protect Harper and Lila," he said, his voice steady, "then I'll end this myself." Before Harper could react, Nathaniel pulled out a small syringe from Anderson's briefcase, one that Harper hadn't noticed before, and injected it into his own arm. Anderson's eyes widened in horror. "No, what are you doing?" Nathaniel turned to Harper, his eyes filled with love and sadness. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "but I won't let them hurt you again." And then he collapsed, leaving Harper to catch him, her screams echoing through the empty lounge. Harper cradled Nathaniel in her arms, her heart shattered as she watched the life drain from his eyes. She screamed for help, but deep down, she knew it was too late. The syringe had done its work, and Nathaniel's body lay limp, his breathing shallow and irregular. Anderson stood frozen, her face pale with shock as she realized the gravity of what had just happened. "Nathaniel, please," Harper whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Don't do this. You have to stay with me. You have to stay with us." But Nathaniel's eyes, though dim, still managed to find hers. He reached up, his hand trembling as he gently touched her face, wiping away her tears. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "I didn't want it to end this way, but it was the only way to make sure you were safe." Harper's heart ached, and she clutched his hand tightly, desperate to keep him with her. "We could have fought this together," she said, her voice choked with grief. "Why did you have to do this?" "Because I remember now," Nathaniel said, his breathing labored. "I remember everything. I know what they were planning, and I couldn't let them take control again. If I was gone, they wouldn't have any more power over me, over you, or Lila." Harper's sobs grew louder, but she tried to listen, hanging on to every word. "I love you," she said, her voice cracking. "I never stopped loving you, Nathaniel, not for a single day." Nathaniel's lips curled into a weak smile. "I love you too," he whispered, his eyes glistening with tears. "And I always will. Even if I'm not here, I'll always be with you." His breathing grew fainter, and Harper felt a wave of panic wash over her. "No, please, don't leave me," she begged. But Nathaniel's hand slipped from her cheek, falling to his side. His eyes closed, and with a final shallow breath, he was gone. Harper felt the world collapse around her. She held Nathaniel's body close, her tears soaking his shirt as she rocked back and forth, unable to accept that he was truly gone. The man she had loved, the man she had fought so hard to save, had sacrificed himself to protect her. It was a cruel, devastating end, and she didn't know how she was supposed to go on without him. But even in her grief, Harper's mind was still clear enough to recognize the danger. Anderson was still there, and she couldn't let her get away with everything she had done. Harper looked up, her eyes burning with a mix of sorrow and fury as she faced Anderson, who was now inching toward the door, trying to slip away unnoticed. "You're not going anywhere," Harper said, her voice cold and unyielding. "You did this. You and your twisted, manipulative plans. You took everything from him, and now you're going to answer for it." Anderson's eyes flashed with fear, but she quickly masked it with her usual arrogance. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, trying to regain her composure. "This was his choice. He did this to himself." "No," Harper said, shaking her head. He did it because you left him no other choice. You pushed him to this, and you're going to pay for what you've done." She pulled out her phone, quickly dialing 911 and giving the dispatcher the information they needed. Then she added, "I've got all the proof I need to bring you down. The treatments, the drugs, everything. It's over." Anderson's composure cracked, and for the first time, Harper saw true panic in her eyes. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "There are people involved in this who are much bigger than me. If you go through with this, you're putting yourself in danger. You're putting your daughter in danger." Harper's heart clenched at the mention of Lila, but she didn't back down. "I don't care," she said. "Nathaniel did everything he could to protect us, and now it's my turn. I'm not going to let you or anyone else hurt my family again." The sound of approaching sirens echoed through the hallway, and Anderson's face paled as she realized there was no escape. She tried to bolt, but Harper blocked her path, refusing to let her get away. "It's over," she said again, her voice firm. "You're going to face justice for what you did." The police arrived within minutes, and Anderson was taken into custody, her protests falling on deaf ears. Harper watched as she was led away in handcuffs, a strange sense of emptiness settling over her. She had won, but it didn't feel like a victory. She had lost Nathaniel, and no amount of justice could make up for that. As the paramedics arrived and took Nathaniel's body away, Harper felt like a part of herself had been ripped away, leaving her hollow and broken. She wanted to scream, to cry, to lash out at the unfairness of it all, but she knew she had to stay strong for Lila's sake. She couldn't let Nathaniel's sacrifice be in vain. Days passed in a blur, and Harper found herself drifting through the motions of life, unsure how to move forward. She attended the small, private funeral for Nathaniel, saying goodbye to the man she loved for the second time. It hurt just as much as it had the first time, but she knew she had to keep going. Nathaniel had given her a chance to start over, and she owed it to him to make the most of it. A few weeks after the funeral, Harper received a package in the mail. There was no return address, but when she opened it, she found a letter inside, written in Nathaniel's handwriting. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the paper, and tears filled her eyes as she began to read. "Harper, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and I'm sorry I couldn't be there to say goodbye. I wish things could have been different, but I want you to know that I'm at peace knowing you and Lila are safe. I've made arrangements to make sure you're taken care of, so you won't have to worry about anything. There's a trust set up for Lila's future, and I hope it will give her the life I always wanted her to have. I'm sorry I couldn't be there to watch her grow up, but I know you'll take care of her. You've always been the strongest person I know, and I hope you'll find a way to move on and be happy again. I love you, Harper, more than words can ever say. Please, don't let my memory be a burden. Let it be a reminder of how much I loved you and how much I wanted to protect you. That love will never fade, no matter where I am. Yours always, Nathaniel." Harper's tears blurred the words, but she read the letter over and over, clutching it to her chest as she let the sobs she had been holding back finally escape. Nathaniel had thought of everything, even in his final moments, making sure she and Lila would be okay. It was the kind of selfless love that had defined him, and it was the reason she had fallen in love with him in the first place. As she wiped her tears, Harper felt a strange sense of peace wash over her. Nathaniel was gone, but his love was still with her, guiding her, giving her the strength to carry on. She would cherish his memory, not as a source of pain, but as a beacon of hope. He had given her the chance to start anew, and she would honor that gift by living a life that was full of love and happiness, just as he would have wanted. And so, with Nathaniel's letter in her hand and his love in her heart, Harper looked to the future, ready to begin a new chapter, knowing that no matter what happened, she would never truly be alone.